3 seconds. That was exactly how long it took for the digital invoices to betray their author. The billing data wasn't coming from an overseas maritime logistics firm. The IP trace currently glowing on my secondary monitor pinpointed an internal server located on this exact floor. I watched the encrypted data packets bounce across the screen, forming a neat, undeniably fraudulent loop. And every forged digital approval attached to those phantom payments carried Oaklee Rogers' name clean, perfectly formatted, and professionally deadly. The coastal wind hit the third-floor windows with a heavy, rhythmic thud, rattling the thick glass of the corporate office. Below me, the expansive flagship bookstore was completely dark. The air still smelled deeply of old paper, roasted espresso from the lobby cafe, and the aggressive salt spray from the ocean just 50 yards away. My hands remained perfectly steady over the mechanical keyboard as I locked the highlighted IP node into a secure, heavily encrypted file. The heavy oak door to the conference room opened with a sharp, echoing click. I did not break my visual lock on the dual monitors. The blue light from the screens cast harsh, geometric shadows across the long, polished mahogany table that had served as my operational base for the last 96 hours. "The building is secured for the night," I stated, tapping a final command sequence to finalize the encryption of the trace data. "All non-essential personnel are required to badge out by 1900 hours. I don't adhere to arbitrary curfews when my entire department is under a hostile, bad faith audit." I turned my heavy leather chair. Oaklee Rogers stood in the doorway. She wore a tailored navy blazer and dark trousers, her posture completely rigid, her shoulders pulled back defensively. She held a thick, physical file folder gripped so tightly against her side that the heavy cardboard was visibly buckling under the pressure. She walked forward, stopping on the opposite side of the massive conference table. She dropped the heavy file onto the polished wood. The thud echoed sharply in the quiet, cavernous room. "Marcus Davis is setting me up," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, absolute register. She said 10 a.m. again, slower, like she was pinning the time to the table so it couldn't move. "If the board votes tomorrow, she is fired and the company files civil charges against her for embezzlement by the end of the day. Marcus Davis, the chief financial officer, doesn't need to steal the capital quietly. He just needs her to look guilty on paper long enough to push her out of the company and close the ledger permanently." "Kaizen Collins," she continued, her heels planted firmly against the hardwood floor. She didn't look like a woman caught in a lie. She looked like an executive preparing for a brutal siege. "You've been inside my operational network for 4 consecutive days. You have pulled 5 years of my historical data. Yet, you haven't asked me a single clarifying question. I do not require human testimony to map a financial structure," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat, projecting zero emotional bias. "The ledger provides the complete, unfiltered narrative. People possess motives, blind spots, and self-preservation instincts. Spreadsheets possess only integers. The math does not lie unless someone explicitly forces it to." Oaklee's jaw tightened. "Davis claims my department is masking a massive deficit to cover regional expansion losses. I did not authorize those missing funds. I built the logistics pipeline for this company from the ground up. I oversee 20 coastal retail locations. I track every single pallet of books that hits our loading docks. The deficit is currently standing at $642,410, I corrected mildly, ensuring the absolute parameters of the crisis were exact. "And you are the final signatory on the Apex Maritime accounts." A sharp flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed her features. "You are the external auditor. You have the master access codes. Are you going to hand him the empirical hammer to nail my coffin shut?" "My license and contract dictate an impartial, empirical audit," I replied, refusing to match her elevated emotional state. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands. If I submit flawed data to appease a corrupt CFO, my professional license is instantly revoked, and my firm's global credibility burns to the ground. I do not file flawed data. It is a strict contractual mandate that I dismantle this anomaly, regardless of who constructs the trap. The rigid line of her spine finally bowed, just a fraction of a millimeter. She let out a slow, measured breath that ruffled the top edge of the printed shipping manifest protruding from her folder. She stopped gripping the wood. She picked up the heavy file, set it flat square to the table, aligning the edges perfectly with the wood grain like a binding legal contract. "I pulled the hard copies of the regional shipping manifests from the sub-basement archive an hour ago," Oaklee stated. sliding the heavy folder across the mahogany surface toward me. Every single maritime logistics contract we hold for the West Coast expansion is in there. Apex Maritime Logistics is not an authorized vendor. I did not sign those digital payment approvals. Her methodology was structurally sound, but in forensic accounting, physical possession requires strict verification of the source. I need to verify the exact chain of custody for these documents, I told her, standing up from my chair and buttoning my dark suit jacket. Show me exactly where you pulled these from the archive. Oaklee didn't argue. She didn't complain about the lack of immediate trust. She simply nodded once. Follow me. We left the conference room and walked in total silence to the service elevator. The descent to the sub-basement was slow, the mechanical gears grinding against the building's slight sway in the coastal wind. The air grew noticeably colder as the metal doors parted, the heavy, musty scent of degrading cellulose and damp concrete instantly replacing the refined, filtered atmosphere of the executive floors above us. The archive room was a massive, dimly lit grid of reinforced steel shelving units housing over a decade's worth of corporate history. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically as the storm outside wreaked havoc on the local power grid. Oaklee navigated the labyrinthine maze without a moment of hesitation, her movements precise and calculated. She didn't need to read the faded end cap labels. Her spatial memory of the facility she had built was flawless. Row 42. Section C, she said, stopping in front of a long row of dense, standardized cardboard banker's boxes. She pointed to a dark gap in the sequence. That is where the 2023 regional manifests are kept. I stepped closer, pulling a small, high-lumen tactical flashlight from my pocket to inspect the area. I angled the bright beam across the tops of the adjacent cardboard boxes. The thick dust line on the box was completely unbroken, except for the precise, clean rectangular square where her specific folder had been resting. There were no secondary fingerprints, no wiped surfaces, no signs of external tampering. The physical evidence corroborated her timeline perfectly. Your digital signature is currently attached to 54 separate, high-value transactions over the past 8 months, I said, turning off the flashlight and looking at her in the dim, shadowed aisle. The network routing unequivocally traces back to your specific terminal on the second floor. Then my terminal is compromised. Oaklee fired back without hesitation, her voice echoing slightly off the damp concrete walls. Davis controls the entire IT infrastructure. He has absolute administrative access. He possesses the exact clearance required to mirror my credentials and bypass the standard two-factor authentication. I paused. Her logical hypothesis aligned perfectly with the IP anomaly I had discovered less than 20 minutes ago. She was not a helpless victim seeking a sudden savior. She had logically diagnosed her own operational failure, identified the hostile variable, and brought me the physical proof required to fight it. Let's go back upstairs, I said, my mind already calculating the necessary legal decryption parameters. I have something to show you. Back in the third-floor conference room, the storm had intensified, heavy rain lashing violently against the panoramic glass. I sat back down at my workstation, minimizing the primary disbursement ledger and opening the raw data trace. Step around the table, I instructed. Look at the screen. Oaklee hesitated for a fraction of a second. Trust was a severe operational liability in her current position, but she walked around the heavy table and stood beside my chair, maintaining a strict, calculated professional distance. This is the internal routing pathway for the Apex Maritime invoices, I said, tracking the cursor across a complex visual web of data nodes. The payments are definitively authorized under your digital signature. However, the origination IP address for the initial invoice generation does not match your office terminal on the second floor. Oaklee leaned closer, her dark eyes scanning the glowing green code, absorbing the data structure. Where does it originate? It originates from a dedicated, secure server on the 4th floor, I said, hitting a keystroke to highlight the final node in bright yellow. The executive suite? Specifically, the private subnet assigned to Marcus Davis. Oaklee exhaled a sharp, harsh breath, the sound loud in the quiet room. He's running the ghost vendor from his own floor. He assumed an external auditor would stop at the digital signature and refuse to dig into the deeper subnet routing protocols, I observed. Closing the window to secure the data. It relies heavily on the systemic laziness of the investigator. You aren't lazy, she noted, looking down at me, her gaze entirely focused. I am thorough. I turned my chair to face her completely, establishing direct eye contact. But we have a critical structural problem. The IP trace is circumstantial evidence. Davis can easily claim his subnet was hijacked by an external threat. To prove definitive, unassailable fraud and clear your liability before tomorrow's 10 a.m. vote, I need to trace the money from the Apex Shell account to a personal asset directly controlled by him. Can you do it? The correspondent bank trail wasn't a hack, it was mandatory reporting, and Davis forgot it existed, I stated plainly, rejecting the impossible, cinematic narrative of instantly breaking into a Cayman Island server. I can subpoena the correspondent bank trails through my firm's legal compliance portal and match the beneficiary metadata attached to the wire transfers. If Davis is alerted by a flagged query in the system, he will initiate a retaliatory protocol. He will freeze your operational accounts immediately to force your termination before the meeting. Let him try, Oaklee said, crossing her arms, presenting an absolute, unyielding front against the threat. I will manage the operational fallout on the floor. I will keep the regional stores running. You follow the correspondent trails. We divided the battlefield cleanly. It was a pure, strategic alliance based on mutual competence. I need access to your personal financial records, I requested calmly, maintaining strict professional boundaries. To prove you did not receive the stolen funds, I must audit your private accounts to establish an irrefutable baseline of innocence. I will not execute the search without your explicit consent. Oaklee held my gaze. She recognized the necessity of the intrusion to fortify her defense. You have my full, explicit consent. Kaizen, find the money. At midnight, the compliance portal kicked back my first data request due to international privacy firewalls. At 1:12, the legal clearance processed, and the metadata began to flow. At 2, the conference room door opened quietly. Oaklee walked in. She had not gone home. She was wearing a heavy, oversized knit sweater over her work clothes, holding 2 large, steaming ceramic mugs. She didn't speak immediately. She walked to the table, placed one mug precisely 2 inches from my right hand, and sat down in the leather chair adjacent to mine. The dark liquid smelled of rich, dark roast espresso, perfectly brewed. The steam curled upward, a stark contrast to the freezing rain lashing against the glass behind her. Black coffee, no sugar, no dairy. Sourced from the Guatemalan roast in the lobby cafe, Oaklee recited quietly, taking a sip from her own mug, which smelled faintly of vanilla and oat milk. I manage regional logistics. Remembering operational data points is my primary function. You ordered it on Tuesday at 0800. She reached into her pocket and slid a small, foil-wrapped pastry across the desk until it bumped gently against the edge of my mechanical keyboard. Sign here, she said, her tone completely dry, utilizing the language of our environment to offer a small, crucial piece of comfort. Caloric intake is mandatory emergency funding. You are burning too much fuel. I picked up the mug. The ceramic was incredibly hot. It was a precise temperature, suggesting she hadn't just grabbed it from a carafe. She had timed the pour to ensure maximum heat retention. The warmth seeped into my cold palms, providing an immediate, grounding physical sensation. The metadata cross-reference is currently at 78% completion, I noted, taking a careful drink. The brew was exact. It tasted like pure, unadulterated focus. Davis was in my office this afternoon, Oaklee said quietly, staring out at the rain-streaked window, watching the water distort the city lights below. He demanded the Q4 operational projections for the new coastal locations. He smiled the entire time he was talking to me. He thinks he has me entirely boxed in. His confidence is a statistical error, I replied, setting the mug down and unwrapping the foil from the pastry. Her hand was gripping the handle of her ceramic mug so tightly her knuckles were stark white. The immense stress of the impending board vote was accumulating, threatening to crack her carefully maintained composure. She was holding the weight of 20 retail locations and hundreds of employees on her shoulders. I offered a concrete tactical adjustment. Move your chair closer, I instructed softly. She looked at me, a brief flash of hesitation in her eyes, before she slid her heavy leather chair 2 feet to the left, entering my immediate physical proximity. The subtle scent of vanilla cut through the stale, recycled air of the corporate office. I reached out and gently tapped the spacebar on my keyboard, pausing the rapid scroll of the banking logs. I pulled up a secondary screen. It displayed a highly organized, meticulously color-coded operational calendar I had built over the last 4 hours while the compliance software ran its cycles in the background. "What is this?" she asked, leaning in slightly to read the detailed, block text entries. I accessed the operational database using your public framework, I explained, keeping my voice level and calm. I mapped your specific vendor deadlines, your regional staff payroll schedules, and your massive inventory delivery windows for the next 3 weeks. I synchronized all of those data points against the projected timeline of Davis's retaliation. Oaklee stared at the calendar. Every single one of her critical operational stress points had been identified, categorized, and secured. I had mapped the delivery routes for the Oregon branches, the emergency HVAC maintenance schedules for the California locations, and the precise times the corporate purchasing cards needed to clear the central ledger. If Davis attempts to freeze your accounts tomorrow morning, I continued, pointing to a highlighted blue note on the screen, I have pre-drafted authorization overrides using the parent company's untouched emergency reserve account. We don't need to patch the system or hack his override. We just legally reroute the funding through a documented, compliant channel. You will not miss a single vendor payment. You will not lose a single delivery. I have secured your perimeter. She was completely silent. The ambient noise of the heavy storm outside seemed to fade entirely into the background. She looked from the meticulously organized calendar up to my face. The guarded, heavily defensive posture she had maintained for a week finally dissolved. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the desk, her fingers resting less than an inch from my own. She didn't cross the boundary, but the proximity was highly deliberate, an undeniable physical acknowledgement of the safety I had constructed for her. You did this while you were tracking the metadata? She whispered, her voice carrying a profound sense of realization. Your operational stability is the primary variable holding this company together, I stated simply. It was logical to protect it. Thank you, Kaisen, she said, the words carrying a heavy, undeniable weight. You are welcome. I looked at her hand resting near mine. I pulled my hand back, tightened my grip on the ceramic mug, and hit the spacebar to resume the code sequence. The query requires my attention. At 0915, his freeze hit. That's when the spreadsheet became a weapon. I was in the conference room. The metadata query had finished perfectly. The screen flashed a verified, brilliant green. 3 matching timestamps, 3 matching routing codes. I had definitively traced the $642,000 from the Apex Maritime Shell Company directly into a private wealth management fund in the Bahamas, verified through the correspondent bank's mandatory reporting logs. The mathematical proof was utterly unassailable. My phone vibrated violently against the wood table. It was Oaklee. Kaisen, she said, her voice sharp, entirely devoid of panic but laced with pure adrenaline. Davis just made his move. Specify the action. I immediately opened a new terminal, pulling up the banking portals. My fingers hit the keys with practiced, rapid precision. My department's operational accounts are locked. All of them. Elena, the flagship manager, is already calling voice-tight, dock noise behind her. The delivery drivers are threatening to pull away because the receiving checks are bouncing at the terminal. Davis triggered a total financial freeze. He locked the master grid. My hands flew across the keyboard. I bypassed the standard login screen. The screen flashed a severe warning red. Error 404. Account suspended pending internal review. He cited the ongoing audit as justification for the freeze. Oaklee continued over the line, the sound of chaotic office chatter loud in the background. He's forcing a massive public crisis right before the meeting. If the stores can't process transactions, we lose $100,000 in daily revenue. Do not leave your office. Do not engage him, I advised, my voice dropping into a cold, hyper-focused register. He wants a highly public confrontation to demonstrate your instability to the board. He wants you to lose your temper. I have 40 employees across 3 states who cannot purchase essential supplies or accept deliveries. Oaklee fired back, the pressure mounting. You will not have to wait. I pulled up the emergency calendar. I executed the pre-drafted authorization overrides. My audit letter included Emergency Continuity Authority Rare, but written for exactly this kind of fraud. I legally rerouted the operational funding through the parent company's untouched reserve account, bypassing his frozen lines completely. Oaklee, listen to me, I said, watching the green confirmation bars light up on my screen, signifying the transfer of funds. The reserve reroute is documented and active. Tell Elena to stall the driver. The registers will reactivate within a minute after she reruns the batch. The line was silent for 10 agonizing seconds. I could hear her breathing, the sheer tension radiating through the digital connection as she relayed the order. Then, a voice in the background called out, Oaklee, It went through. The registers are online. Oaklee let out a harsh, staggering breath of relief. The network is running. The bypass will hold, I stated, slamming my laptop shut and grabbing the massive physical file containing the offshore routing proofs. We do not need 48 hours. We need 10 minutes. I will meet you at the elevator banks. I stood in the sleek, glass-walled hallway outside the executive boardroom. The air smelled of expensive cologne, floor wax, and polished leather. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Oaklee stepped out. She wore a dark, gray, impeccably tailored suit. Her posture was flawless, projecting absolute, unyielding authority. She held a single, slim, manila folder in her left hand. She looked at me, her eyes completely devoid of the exhaustion I had seen at 2 a.m. The perimeter is secure, I told her quietly, stepping to her side. Let's break the door down, she replied. We walked into the boardroom together. The space was massive, dominated by a long mahogany table. 5 regional board members sat in heavy leather chairs, reviewing tablets. Marcus Davis stood at the head of the table, his hands resting confidently on the polished wood. He was in the middle of a speech, and therefore, due to the critical operational failures and the severe, ongoing mismanagement of capital funds, I motioned for the immediate termination of the Director of Operations. Davis concluded smoothly, looking around the room. The room went entirely silent as we walked in. We did not ask for permission to enter. We simply claimed the space. That motion is procedurally invalid, Marcus, I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the vast room. I did not raise my volume. I relied entirely on the absolute authority of empirical data. You cannot terminate an executive based on a fabricated premise. The chairman of the board frowned, adjusting his glasses, clearly irritated by the disruption. Mr. Collins, you are the external auditor. You do not have standing to disrupt this internal proceeding. I am executing my mandate, Mr. Chairman, I replied, walking forward and dropping the massive 3-inch thick file onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed sharply off the glass walls. I was hired to locate $642,000 in missing capital. I have located it. Davis's confident smile faltered by a fraction of a millimeter. The audit is incomplete. You cannot submit unverified findings to the board. The findings are mathematically absolute, I countered, looking directly at Davis. I turned to the chairman. The capital was not lost to inventory mismanagement. It was actively siphoned through a ghost vendor named Apex Maritime Logistics. The digital approvals were forged using a mirrored credential exploit originating from the dedicated subnet assigned to the chief financial officer, Marcus Davis. The boardroom erupted into chaotic murmurs. The board members turned to look at Davis, their expressions shifting rapidly from shock to severe scrutiny. This is absurd, Davis snapped, his voice rising, pointing an accusatory finger at Oaklee. She signed the documents. Her physical authorization is on the secondary disbursement contracts. Actually, it isn't. Oaklee interjected, her voice cutting through the noise like a newly sharpened blade. She stepped entirely out of my shadow and claimed her own space at the table. She opened her slim manila folder. I pulled the archived, hard-copy disbursement contracts from the regional vault this morning, Oaklee stated, pulling a pristine document from the folder. The physical paperwork Davis claims holds my signature. She walked over to the chairman and placed the document precisely in front of him. If you review Section 4, Clause B of that specific contract, I added, perfectly synchronized with her movement, you will note a catastrophic legal error. The contract stipulates that secondary disbursements must be authorized by a bonded corporate officer with a Class A fiduciary rating. Ms. Rogers holds a Class B operational rating. She is legally incapable of binding the company to that tier of financial disbursement. The signature is a forgery, and the contract fails its own internal logic. The chairman stared at the contract, his face draining of color as he grasped the profound liability. I can explain the routing anomaly, Davis began, panic finally seizing his throat as he realized the trap was closing. There is no anomaly, I interrupted, sliding a heavily redacted bank statement across the table. The Apex Maritime account automatically transfers its balance every 72 hours into a private wealth management fund in the Bahamas, verified through the correspondent bank's mandatory reporting logs. A fund that, according to the metadata, was opened exactly 3 days after you personally proposed the Q3 regional expansion budget. The primary beneficiary of that fund is Marcus Davis. The chairman picked up the statement. His eyes scanned the highlighted routing numbers. The math left absolutely no room for debate or misinterpretation. He did not look at Davis. He looked directly at the head of corporate security standing near the heavy double doors. Escort Mr. Davis to his office. Confiscate his badge and electronics. Terminate his access immediately. Security's hand closed firmly on Davis's physical badge before he could even reach for his phone to call legal counsel. He was escorted out of the room in total silence, the reality of his failure absolute. The chairman let out a heavy breath, removing his glasses, and looked at Oaklee. Miss Rogers. The board extends its deepest apologies for this profound breach of trust. Your operational accounts will be fully restored within the hour. They are already restored, Oaklee replied, her posture unyielding. Mr. Collins bypassed the illegal freeze this morning through a compliant reserve reroute to ensure our coastal stores did not suffer operational failure. I expect a formal, written retraction of the allegations by end of day. It will be drafted immediately, the chairman conceded. Oaklee closed her folder. Then, this meeting is concluded. We took the elevator down to the ground floor and walked into the massive, coastal flagship bookstore. The transition from the sterile, hostile environment of the executive suite to the warm, lived-in space of the retail floor was jarring, but incredibly welcome. The severe storm had finally broken, and pale sunlight was streaming through the massive front windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floorboards and illuminating the thousands of volumes lining the oak shelves. The air smelled deeply of old paper, the roasted espresso from the corner cafe, and the clean salt breeze coming off the harbor. The store was fully operational. Customers were browsing the aisles, completely unaware of the corporate war that had just been won 3 floors above them. The cash registers were chiming in a steady, reassuring rhythm. The system was alive and healthy. She had built this, and it was still standing perfectly intact. We stopped near the poetry section, a quiet alcove shielded by tall shelves that muffled the ambient noise of the store. Oaklee leaned against the wooden edge of a display table. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, clicked the side button to lock the screen, and set it face down on the wood. The rigid line of her shoulders finally, completely relaxed. You completely dismantled him, she said, looking up at me, her dark eyes shining in the soft light. The data simply required proper formatting, I replied, adjusting my suit jacket. It wasn't just the data, Kaizen. Oaklee took a deliberate step closer, intentionally bridging the physical distance between us. You built a secondary calendar just to protect my staff. You didn't just audit the company. You guarded the perimeter. For years, I had kept a meticulous, calculated distance from everyone I worked with, assuming hidden variables and hidden agendas in every human interaction. But looking at the quiet sincerity in her expression, the rigid tension in my own shoulders finally unhooked. I protect the systems that possess structural integrity, I said, my voice dropping. The clinical, analytical edge, entirely gone. Your integrity is flawless, Oaklee. It was highly logical to defend it. She smiled. She reached out and gently rested her hand on my forearm, her fingers curving lightly over the fabric of my suit sleeve. The physical contact sent a sudden, grounding warmth through my system. She didn't need to present a spreadsheet to prove her intent. Her hand resting on my arm, the direct, unwavering eye contact, it was the only proof I required. I thrive on the logistics, the problem-solving, the chaos of this job, Oaklee said quietly, holding my gaze. But standing in that boardroom, realizing I didn't have to fight him alone, she took a slow breath. I want to build something real with you. In the daylight. Not just when the system is crashing. Just then, Elena, the flagship store manager, walked past the aisle carrying a heavy stack of hardcover books. Oaklee turned to her, keeping her hand resting comfortably under mine. She didn't step back. She called Elena over first. Elena, Oaklee called out, her voice carrying a clear, proud authority. Please log Mr. Collins into the master security system. He is our new, permanent compliance partner. Elena smiled broadly, looking between the two of us. Right away, Director. Welcome aboard, Mr. Collins. Elena walked away, leaving us in the quiet aisle. Oaklee reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a blue, corporate-issued access badge attached to a lanyard. She had pre-printed my name on it. She handed me the badge like a signed contract, quiet, final, and unmistakably chosen. Your workspace is assigned on the 3rd floor. Right next to mine, Oaklee said, her smile widening. The 6-month contract starts tomorrow. You want me on the payroll? I noted, looping the lanyard around my wrist. After that, all I said was, I'm here. I want you exactly where you are, she corrected, stepping closer. Now, we need to address a critical logistical failure. What failure? Are the registers down again? No, she said, looking at my watch. You missed breakfast, and we require immediate caloric intake. I have plotted a route to a coastal seafood restaurant exactly 4 blocks from here. We have a dinner reservation at 6. I shook my head, a genuine smile breaking across my face as the comforting scent of espresso and old paper settled entirely around us. Lead the way, Oaklee. Tomorrow at 8, my desk would be beside hers and my keycard would work. Real safety is earned, proved in the daylight and in the fine print. He didn't just make promises, he built the protection and showed up. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.